Teach me how to be happy. The words were meant as a joke, the kind wealthy men toss into the air between bites of steak and expensive laughter, but the moment they left Daniel Whitmore's mouth, something in the room quietly shifted. High above Midtown Manhattan, on the glass rooftop of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, the skyline stretched for miles in every direction, glowing in soft gold and white lights like a promise of endless success. Daniel sat at the center of a long marble table surrounded by investors, executives, and two venture capitalists who had just flown in from San Francisco. At 38, Daniel Whitmore was the kind of billionaire magazines like to photograph beside skyscrapers he had helped finance. His tailored navy suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his watch reflected the warm light of the chandelier above the table each time he lifted his glass. To everyone around him, he looked like a man who had already solved life. That was exactly why the comment drew laughter. One of the investors leaned back in his chair, chuckling. Careful what you wish for, Daniel. You might actually get advice. Another guest added, yeah, and judging by the restaurant prices tonight, it won't be cheap. The table erupted in polite amusement, the kind practiced in rooms where everyone understood the rules of power. The waitress standing beside Daniel had been quietly pouring sparkling water when the comment was made. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She looked no older than 28, with light brown hair pulled into a simple knot and the calm posture of someone who had spent long nights balancing trays through crowded dining rooms. She had been invisible to the table only seconds before, just another server moving through the rhythm of the evening. But when Daniel finished his sentence, Emily stopped pouring. Not dramatically, just enough that the stream of water paused in the crystal glass. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Most waitresses would have laughed politely and stepped away. That was the expected script. Instead, Emily placed the bottle gently on the table and looked at him with an expression that wasn't offended, nervous, or impressed. Just thoughtful. The laughter at the table began to fade when they noticed she hadn't walked away yet. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, curious now. He had made a career out of reading people quickly, and something about the quiet confidence in her eyes didn't fit the role he had assumed for her. Well, one of the guests joked. You heard the man. Teach him. Emily considered the request for a second longer, as if measuring whether the moment deserved an answer at all. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear enough that everyone at the table could hear it. Start by asking people who don't have what you have. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't loud, but the effect was immediate. The laughter stopped completely. Even the clink of silverware faded. Daniel Whitmore, a man used to controlling every conversation in every room he entered, suddenly found himself leaning back in his chair, studying a waitress he had noticed only moments earlier. Because something about the way she said it made the question feel real for the first time. And somewhere between the skyline outside the window and the quiet stillness now settling over the table, the richest man in the room realized he might have just asked the wrong person a question he didn't actually know how to answer. For a few seconds, no one reached for their wine. The skyline outside still shimmered beyond the tall glass walls, traffic crawling along Fifth Avenue nearly 40 stories below, but inside the room the atmosphere had shifted into something quieter and harder to ignore. Daniel Whitmore studied the young woman standing beside the table as if she had suddenly stepped out of a different story entirely. Most people spoke to him with careful enthusiasm, their tone polished by ambition or caution, but Emily Carter had spoken as if his money had nothing to do with the question. Daniel slowly set his glass down on the white tablecloth. Across the table, one of the investors cleared his throat and forced a small laugh. That was surprisingly philosophical for a dinner service. Another guest smiled politely, though the humor felt thinner now. Emily did not react to the comment. She simply lifted the bottle again and finished filling the last glass with the same steady precision she had shown earlier. The quiet confidence in her movements made it clear that she had already returned to her work, whether the table understood the moment or not. Daniel leaned slightly forward in his chair. Hold on, he said, his voice calm. But curious. You just dropped that line like it was obvious. Emily glanced at him, not defensive, not impressed, simply attentive the way good service required. Obvious things are often the hardest to notice, she replied. One of the venture capitalists raised his eyebrows. So you are saying the richest guy in the room should be asking the poorest for life advice? Emily shook her head gently. I am saying happiness looks different depending on what someone has had to live without. The sentence settled over the table like a quiet weight. Daniel watched her more closely now. Up close he noticed details he had ignored before. The calm focus in her eyes. The measured rhythm of someone who had learned patience through long evenings of work. She did not look intimidated by the suits, the watches, or the expensive dinner that had already climbed past $300 a plate. In fact, she looked like someone who had seen rooms like this before and chosen not to care. Daniel found himself unexpectedly curious about that. Tell me something, he said. If you were in my position, what would you change? The guests around the table leaned back, amused again by the idea of the billionaire asking the waitress for guidance. Emily did not answer immediately. She reached over to straighten a fork that had shifted slightly out of place beside one of the plates. Then she looked at Daniel again. Honestly, she asked. Honestly, Daniel replied. She studied the table for a moment as if measuring the room itself. I would start by noticing how quiet people get when someone with power asks a real question. The comment drew a few awkward smiles. Daniel let out a small breath through his nose, half amused, half thoughtful. Because she was not wrong. Just minutes earlier, everyone had been laughing easily. Now the conversation had slowed, and the room felt less like a performance. Outside the glass wall, the city continued its restless movement, millions of people rushing through their evening routines. It created space for questions, and questions had a way of revealing things success usually managed to hide. But the quiet now stretching across the table felt different. It was not awkward. It was curious. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, resting one arm on the polished marble as he studied the waitress standing beside him. Emily Carter did not shift under the attention. She simply waited with the same calm patience she had shown all evening, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady, as if moments like this happened more often than anyone at the table would guess. One of the investors finally broke the stillness with a small chuckle. You are starting to sound like a philosopher, Miss Carter. Emily shook her head gently. No, sir. Just observant. The answer drew a few polite smiles. Daniel noticed how easily she spoke without trying to impress anyone. That alone made her different from almost every person he had met in rooms like this. In his world, people usually had something to sell. An idea, a deal, a connection, a future partnership. Even compliments often came with invisible price tags attached. But Emily Carter spoke like someone who had nothing to gain from the conversation at all. Daniel found that strangely refreshing. He glanced around the table at the guests who had joined him that evening. There was Michael Harrington from the investment firm in Boston, Sandra Lee, who ran a real estate group on the West Coast, and two younger entrepreneurs hoping Daniel might eventually fund their startup. Each of them had spent most of the dinner discussing numbers, markets, and the next quarter of growth projections. Those were conversations Daniel understood perfectly. Yet now the most interesting discussion of the night had begun with a waitress holding a water bottle. Daniel rested his chin lightly against his hand. All right, he said thoughtfully. Let us say you are right. Emily raised an eyebrow slightly, not skeptical, simply attentive. Daniel continued. If happiness depends on what someone has lived without, then what do people like us miss? He gestured loosely toward the table, toward the suits and watches and quiet confidence built on years of financial victories. The guests exchanged glances. Some smiled as if the question was entertaining. Others leaned back, curious where the conversation might go next. Emily looked at the table for a moment before answering. Not at the money, not at the expensive wine, but at the people themselves. Most people at this table probably have not had to wait very long for anything, she said calmly. Michael Harrington laughed softly. That is what success does for you. Emily nodded. Exactly. Daniel noticed she did not say it with admiration or criticism, just clarity. She continued, when life moves that fast, people stop noticing small things because they expect the next big thing to arrive soon anyway. The words lingered quietly between them. Daniel followed her gaze to the glass wall behind the table where the city stretched into the distance. Thousands of lights flickered across Manhattan like tiny signals from other lives unfolding far below. People leaving offices, couples walking home, delivery drivers rushing through traffic. A whole city moving at a pace no boardroom could fully control. For a brief moment, Daniel wondered how many of those people were actually happier than the men and women seated at this table. When he looked back at Emily Carter, he realized something unexpected. She was not lecturing them. She was simply describing a world most of them had forgotten how to see. The table remained quiet even after Emily finished speaking. It was not the uncomfortable silence that sometimes followed a joke that failed. It was the kind of silence people entered when they realized a conversation had shifted into unfamiliar territory. Daniel Whitmore rested both hands lightly on the table and looked around at the faces of the guests seated with him. For years he had hosted dinners exactly like this one. Important people, expensive restaurants, conversations about markets, acquisitions, and growth projections that stretched late into the evening. Yet somehow the most honest moment of the night had not come from a boardroom strategist or a financial analyst. It had come from the woman who had been refilling their water glasses. Daniel glanced again at the skyline beyond the glass wall. The city outside continued its restless rhythm. Taxis moved like small streams of light along the avenues. Office towers glowed against the dark sky. Somewhere below, millions of people were finishing their workday, meeting friends, or simply walking home. He wondered how many of them were thinking about happiness right now. Across the table, Sandra Lee leaned forward slightly, her curiosity no longer hidden. "All right," she said with a small smile. "You have our attention now. If fast success makes people overlook small things, what exactly should we be noticing instead?" Emily Carter did not rush the answer. She placed the bottle of sparkling water gently back on the tray she carried and folded her hands in front of her for a moment, as if organizing her thoughts the way someone might before answering a serious question. The calmness in her posture made the moment feel less like a waitress responding to customers and more like a quiet conversation between equals. "Most people chase the next big moment," she said softly. "A promotion, a new investment, a bigger apartment. Something that proves the last achievement was only a step toward something better." Michael Harrington nodded casually. "That is how ambition works." Emily agreed with a small nod. "Yes, but the problem with always chasing the next milestone is that people begin to treat their current life like a waiting room." The words drifted across the table with surprising weight. "Long shifts in restaurants spend a lot of time watching others," she replied. The guests at the table chuckled quietly, but Daniel noticed that no one dismissed the comment anymore. Because somewhere between the sparkling glasses and the view of Manhattan stretching below them, the quiet waitress had turned an ordinary dinner into something none of them had expected. For a moment no one spoke again. The hum of quiet conversations from other tables drifted through the restaurant, mixing with the soft clinking of glasses and the distant rhythm of traffic far below the building. Daniel Whitmore slowly rotated the stem of his wine glass between his fingers, his attention still fixed on Emily Carter. The conversation had moved far beyond the casual joke that started it, and yet the woman who had changed the direction of the entire evening stood there with the same calm expression, as if none of this attention surprised her at all. Daniel noticed that. Most people changed when the spotlight turned toward them. Their voices grew louder, their words more careful, their posture slightly more eager. Emily did the opposite. The more the table listened, the quieter she seemed to become. Michael Harrington leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said slowly, "most people would have taken that question as an opportunity." Daniel finally asked the question that had begun forming in his mind several minutes earlier. "So what does make a person happier?" Emily did not answer right away. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the wide glass wall where the lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly across the dark horizon. Then she looked back at the table. "Buy it." Sandra Lee leaned back in her chair with a faint smile. "You realize you just turned a business dinner into a philosophy class." Emily gave a small, polite shrug. "I did not mean to interrupt your evening." Michael Harrington waved a hand dismissively, conversations blending into a gentle background hum. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but the words carried an unexpected weight. "A real question," she said, "is one you ask even if the answer might make you uncomfortable." Daniel felt something tighten slightly in his chest. It was not offense. It was recognition. For years he had asked questions designed to move deals forward, questions that produced useful information, questions that helped him maintain control. But he could not remember the last time he had asked something that might genuinely challenge his own assumptions. Sandra Lee tilted her head with a thoughtful smile. "And you think that is what happened tonight?" Emily glanced briefly at Daniel before answering. "He asked how to be happy," she said simply. "Work." She adjusted one of the place settings slightly, aligning the silverware with careful precision before looking back toward Daniel. Between tables, glasses catching the warm glow of the chandelier above, and the soft hum of distant conversations blending with quiet music in the background. Yet at this particular table something had slowed down. Daniel Whitmore remained still for several seconds, his gaze resting on the skyline beyond the glass wall, as if the city itself had suddenly begun asking questions he had not considered before. For most of his life, the view of Manhattan from this height had always meant the same thing to him. Opportunity, growth, achievement measured in numbers that rose year after year. Tonight the lights looked different. Not smaller, not less impressive, just more human. Each glowing window represented someone living a life that was not measured in quarterly reports or acquisition deals. Daniel exhaled slowly and turned his attention back toward the table. Again and again, Daniel considered the sentence carefully.